Thank you, Daniel, and we'll take questions after the three presentations. But let me now welcome Carlota Perez, Professor of Technology and Development from the London School of Economics.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here, although I'm not an expert in the informal sector. I'm a technical change person. I work on technological revolutions and their impact. So what I'm going to try to talk to you about today is how technical change, major technical change like the ICT revolution, changes policy options in the new conditions. There is something that's very important to understand, and it's that there are no good policies in themselves. Policies are only good if they're adequate. And if the context changes, adequacy changes too. So you've got to always look at what is changing in order to know whether the policies that used to work continue to work, the policies that didn't work, will they now work, or should we think of new policies to confront what we have, you know, the things that have been changing. So if we think of what's happening today, that technical change is really transforming the context for development. Globalization happened because of ICT. When we had mass production, we didn't have globalization. We had international trade. We had international relations. And we had the first world, the second world, and the third world. And that was because mass production was really a system which was based upon producing great quantities of identical products, which became low cost thanks to mass production. And then we needed the advanced world needed low-cost energy and low-cost materials, and therefore the third world was not producing these big quantities of things. And when we used import substitution, we ended up just assembling and therefore not learning very much, which, by the way, is one of the causes why our companies are small. Because we didn't start with something where we had everything, the design, the product, and everything, and then you open your market, and then you grow even further, and then you innovate some more. No, we just got mature technologies, and we just got the size that we were supposed to do, very often with very low capacity utilization. And some of those companies have survived, others haven't, but we don't, because of import substitution, which, by the way, was wonderful. I defended 100% for the moment when it was right. Now, it's no longer right, but we are now living with the consequences of the way we set up production then. So just as we had the division between the advanced world and the third world, we had the division between the assembly firms, the big firms, or not only assembly, because the really big ones are the ones that do beer and food and things like that, which were not just assembly firms. Those were the big ones. And then because there was nothing else, we had all this informal sector that sort of filled the little holes. So that was the history. And that is what we have inherited, and that's very much what we sometimes discuss. So what I'd like to do, and I must confess that I haven't gone deeply into this. I'm not working on this now. I'm working on the 5 technological revolutions and the advanced world and the role of the state and so on. So I will just throw the ideas at you and see what happens. This is my first attempt at looking at this thing. So what I say is that some of the old problems remain. Of course, you inherit whatever happened, and then you have to face that. But the old solutions should be re-examined. Maybe the old problems are still there, but maybe we have new solutions for them. So what I'd like to share with you is my thoughts on this for facing or reducing the informal economy. So I begin by wondering what the sources of the informal economy are. Apart from this thing that I just told you, that's the history of how we did import substitution, which there wasn't very much of an option, and we were very successful at doing it. We got a middle class, and we got a lot of employment and a lot of growth, fantastic growth, really fantastic growth during that time, but growth is not enough because we didn't learn much. So I think that the informal economy began by the lack of opportunities in the countryside, because during mass production we didn't really worry about the rural environment, and therefore thousands and thousands of people came with the mirage of the job opportunities in the cities, which of course there's informal economy because it was the mirage. There wasn't that much for everybody. And the lack of opportunities in the slums, of course. When people come to the cities and create these horrendous conditions of living, it's very difficult for that to become a market for people to do things for that. So people get out of the slum and do a little thing over there and then come back to their conditions. So somehow this whole brew that's made up of migrants and their sons and grandchildren and so on that live in this growing area of all our cities, that is the tremendous problem that we inherited from the lack of opportunities in the countryside and from the lack of enough opportunities in the cities. So what have been the attempted solutions? Well, first, try to create enough jobs to absorb them. That wasn't possible, and it still isn't. Try to attract them into the formal economy. That has had some successes. Try to formalize informality with some social security arrangement or something. That also has had some successes. But I wonder whether those are the only ones, and whether, because the world has been changing, maybe there are other possibilities. Technology and globalization have transformed markets. They've created different opportunities, both for their entrepreneurial spirit and for public action to solve the problem. I think it's very important for us to realize that in the slums you have three options. You either become an informal economy person, or you become a criminal, join one of the bands, or you do nothing but just pine and go into this horrible situation of nothingness. So, in fact, the informal economy people are the best. They are, both the criminals and the informal economy want to have a better life. But if you choose to work for that better life, you are a more promising person in society than the people who decide they're just going to steal it or get it somehow. But they both are moving. So we need to create conditions so that people will want to, those migrants who are, actually all migrants are very brave and very wonderful. Everybody should welcome migrants, because to do what they do in order to improve their lives or their children is quite amazing. It's so much easier to be born in an advanced world country where everything is there, even if you could have trouble. But anyway, I'm saying that things have changed. What exactly has changed? Well, first of all, markets are hyper-segmented, including multiple niches at premium prices. So we come from a world where mass production guaranteed low prices for all sorts of things. The other things, the ones that were handmade and the little things and so on, they actually had low prices too. It's really, there was no recognition of the effort. Even a wedding dress or a wedding cake or something, which is a very complicated thing, was not really the way now. Organic food, people pay 3 times as much. And for all sorts of, things like special cereals or this or that, people are willing to pay extra. So there are premium prices in all sorts of things, in materials, in special materials, and so on. So that we have to understand this whole thing about the long tail, Chris Anderson's long tail, which is that maybe now the opportunities are for successful, well-paying, high productivity, small companies also. So it's not the old small companies that are low productivity, but new small companies with high productivity and connected to world markets and all sorts of things. So that has become possible now. Cheap telecoms can allow access to markets from anywhere, including the rural areas of any country. That, by the way, is one of the things that's most important. We've got to guarantee that internet reaches every single corner of the territory otherwise, we are keeping those people out. You know, if we had the informal economy, the people who are outside, now whoever doesn't have a mobile phone is out of this world. So that is one of the most important things. But basically, the thing is that even if you are in a rural area and you produce something from there, you can export it to Germany. And you can make, if there is a network and all the rest, because you have this possibility of working through telecoms. Then we have distribution companies that enable transport of small quantities. You cannot imagine, you know, I actually created a Department of Technological Development in the Ministry of Industry in Venezuela, which is where I come from. And very often we had companies that had fantastic products, and we tried to get them to be able to export to the US. And a couple of times we had it approved. And then they said, okay, we need 20 containers per month. And that was the end of the deal. Because the whole thing was not the quality of the product, but can you produce it in enough quantities that it can go through the distribution systems of the advanced world? Well, fortunately now, we have distribution systems that allow small quantities, and small can be anything from very small, you know, just 100 kilos or something, to really still small, considered international markets. So then we have something else, which is specialized retail outlets that can carry unique products, organic, environmentally friendly, homemade, handmade, etc. But even, obviously, there is also the high-tech thing, which they don't need our help. That's going very well. Even the big supermarkets can carry niche products. You know, when you now see cereals that are gluten-free or no nuts or this or that, very often they're made by small companies that are doing very well, and people, of course, will pay extra because of the special health thing. We now have information about markets and technology, that it's accessible for learning and for decision-making. So that, again, is another thing. It used to be that information was completely inaccessible. Well, now we have much more information than we imagine, and certainly enough for many, many things that have to do with marketing. And then there are organizations such as Fairtrade that can provide support, going from charities to win-win businesses, win-win business networks like Starbucks. Starbucks works with many coffee producers for two reasons. Because they need to guarantee access to quantity, whatever happens to the coffee market, and they need high quality because that's what guarantees that they can charge 4 and 5 times more in their Starbucks, wonderful places that everybody's willing to go to and pay the price for. So they are working with the farmers and creating better conditions for the farmers, better coffee, and they actually fund many of the things that increase their conditions. So it's a very different context from the mass production world in which we created assembly jobs through import substitution. So it was correct at that time to do import substitution in that form, assembly basically. And of course, in the processing of food, we actually had a different condition, because with the assembly thing, we did the end. Even with pills and things in medicines, we got the material and then we punched the pills, so we put it into bottles or whatever. But there was really no innovation associated with it. Whereas in food processing and in chemicals and things like that, very often you had to use the local. So if you had the local tomatoes that were like that, you could make ketchup, yes, but you had to do some innovation in order to make sure that your tomatoes were not round, but they were long. So and then the taste, and then the this, and then the that. So basically, some of our processing industries in Latin America are much more advanced than some of the fabricating ones, the ones that do assembly. And that's because of the nature of that couldn't be really just transplanted like you transplant an assembly plant and you just do it. So the new context makes it possible to innovate in production and to rethink development policies. This is my main message. I hope we have to rethink development policies, not just informal, not just what to do with the big or the all that together, big thinking of some direction in which we can take our economies. And of course, to know that innovation is crucial, that if you don't innovate, you don't grow. That's the other reason why Daniel is talking about our problem with companies that don't grow. They don't innovate, and they don't innovate because they don't have the skills, because they don't have the support, because they don't have the connection with the universities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, could we promote wealth creation directly in the countryside to substantially improve quality of life and reduce migration to the cities? I mean, that would be one way of at least not increasing the informal problem by having more and more slums, by more and more people migrating for the countryside. If we could turn the countryside into a wealth-producing area where those good people who would have emigrated to the cities are the leaders of those companies or those wealth-creating units that we could have in the countryside. And could we promote networks and clusters to improve the condition of informal urban activities? The whole thing about informality is the isolation. If they could work in networks, the ones that do somewhat the same thing, we could provide skills, teach them to do business properly, to professionalize. There is a group, a sort of private NGO type thing group in Venezuela that in that horrendous environment, which is anathema to anything that's practically serious, they have managed to get 8,400 people to work in clubs of entrepreneurs and getting together, professionalizing their work. 24 cities have already this thing, just doing the work of working with the informal sector to turn them into proper companies, but not little companies, but actually trying to get them into systems. That, by the way, is one of the most important things, to have connection between the companies and connections with the knowledge sector that can support them. So what I have been arguing for the past few years is that conditions are favorable in Latin America for designing a strategy of innovation around our natural resources, both high-tech and low-tech. High-tech to be competitive with special materials and biotech and all sorts of things that are related to the fact that we have natural resources and that our labor cannot compete with Chinese labor. Maybe Chinese labor is getting more expensive, but around China there's plenty of low-cost labor that they're going to continue using, and therefore the fabricating industries are very difficult to compete with unless you have a very special product. You know, if you can do embroidery, you're fine. But if you're doing just a regular thing, trying to compete making refrigerators, you're nuts. You're not going to be able to do it, and you're not going to be able to compete making Apple iPhones. So the thing is that we can, because there's going to be plenty of demand, and prices, I trust, are going to go up again because of the same reason. If the world grows, they will go up because there is scarcity. So there's no way, you know, within 5 years, within 10 years, I don't know how many, but there is going to be scarcity because if the world grows, there just aren't enough materials and energy of that sort to sun. There's plenty. So I'm going to give you how I see the whole thing, the big model, the big policy. I see it as a dual integrated model, top-down and grassroots up, with converging processes of wealth creation and innovation associated with this combination of natural resources and technology. So you'd get the companies that would be engines of growth, constantly upgraded production networks around natural resources. I'm sorry I cannot explain this any further. It'll sound a bit cryptic. You can go to my website, carlotaperez.org, and there's plenty talking, writing, whatever, of this whole model of what to do in Latin America. Anyway, the whole idea is that these people would be producing competitive technologies for global markets. But then we would have an interconnected, specialized local economies in clusters all across the territory with a differentiated development of each part of the territory based on the local productive vocation identified or promoted, because in some cases there's nothing really clear there, but there are resources, there are skills or whatever, for domestic or for foreign markets. It depends, you know, in each case. So what's the aim of the top? It's growth and generation of foreign exchange. The aim of the interconnected things at the bottom is to raise the quality of life of all inhabitants. And in between, of course, an active state facilitating and promoting local initiative, infrastructure funds, enabling institutions, human capital, and all the rest. And there are some connections between them because some of the small companies would be actually serving the engines of growth. So such a dual development strategy would need two distinct sets of policies by an active state. The top-down policy framework behaving as a complement to business. Gives policy and political support. It's the so-called embedded autonomy like the Japanese and so on. In achieving synergies, in negotiating with foreign partners. You know, from now on there's going to be a lot of competition between the Far East companies and the Western companies for access to resources. So that's a wonderful opportunity to get something out of them, which is that we process rather than just, you know, that we really go down, not only just processing old style, but processing and innovating into special products, niche products, and so on, high-tech things. So in doing R&D, of course, and in other needs, as defined by the knowledgeable company. So you really work in a very particular sort of consensus, collaborative way with business. The grassroots up policy framework would behave as local development support. So we need the local governments to be active in this. So it promotes and helps identify opportunities and market niches. It gives technical and financial support in setting up the business and in the required innovations. Provides training and offers other needed help to infant companies. And takes or facilitates systemic and network initiatives. Because basically one of the most important things is that we need to do systemic things. So that there is the advantages of networks. So this would require separate institutions and different personnel. Sometimes we have a Ministry of Industry that deals both with the big and with the small. We have a science and technology thing that deals with both the big and the small. That doesn't work. I know it well. I've worked for a long time in the public sector, and I was frustrated all the time by the fact that you couldn't really adapt to both conditions. So I'm going to give you some examples from my experience. I'm sorry, I'm going to be very parochial. I'm going to give you only Venezuelan examples, and basically from before Chavez. But yeah, unfortunately, many have disappeared. But anyway, I'll tell you because they give good examples of what I mean. So one was a case of upgrading an existing product for export. The case of Telita cheese in Upata, which is a relatively medium town near the Orinoco. This is delicious cheese. Now, the thing is that, by the way, this thing was done by somebody who works in CAF. He's his boss, Rafael Fuentes. He organized this from CONICIT. So the starting point was that there was a low productivity and poor hygiene in a set of isolated family firms in actually subsistence economy. They were all over. I mean, Telita cheese is Upata cheese. So, you know, lots of people were making that cheese. Everybody wanted the cheese. So each one more or less did it in its own little neighborhood in the area. So it was only the local market and the use-by date. They didn't have a use-by date, of course, but it got bad in 3 days. So they could only sell it in the neighborhood. So CONICIT, with the support program, the Agendas program, prepares the whole thing, creates a single brand, the Telita cheese thing. They created a single brand for everybody, got them all together, did organized, you know, helped them in organization, high norms of hygiene, and you got to 7 days. As soon as it lasted 7 days, you could bring it to the national markets, to nearby cities. So they created a profitable business, which was a joint company, everybody together, all these companies together. That was not enough. So they brought IVIC, which is the science institute. They identified the bacteria, helped in changes in sterilization and packaging processes, and therefore they got to 3 weeks. And with 3 weeks, they could sell to the Caribbean. So they were competitive for export, and they were a successful enterprise. A huge change in very little time. This happened within about 14, 16 months. So it was really transforming something that wasn't a business, and it was actual informality, into a formal, well-organized, competitive industry. And there are many things that can probably be done that way. So you identify local opportunities, markets, and requirements, and you provide the technical support for taking full advantage of them. Now, how much of this is the state doing? How much of this is actual policy being done? Or is it just, okay, we have to rethink. Do we just take the informal economy as it is and then we try to fix it in itself? Or do we transform the informal economy into, not just formalize each person, we formalize productivity and competitiveness and really serious business? Another example is a nature tourism village in the Andes, which can function alone or in a network. Each village becomes an inn and maintains the cultural traits as the main attraction for tourists. So you have some houses that have the rooms for the guests, others are the restaurant, others are for washing, others artisans and shops, breeding poultry and cattle for the restaurant, school and tourist training for some of the other villages, farming for the restaurant, guides and transport, and so on. So you have every house is fixed, becomes a nice house because it's going to have a job. So the whole village becomes like a hotel. But everybody then, the quality of their life is raised, the quality of their home, the hygiene of their home. And it's done directly, as in contrast with jobs in a hotel, which is what we would normally think. So the network would handle international marketing, services, and management for all. So you get a network so that you get everybody together in one place, plus all the different. I understand this, by the way, was a failed example because the money was taken for something else. But I understand, but I have to find out, maybe some of you know, that there is already a network in the Andes in other countries, not in Venezuela. And then another example, which is a private example, but a very interesting one. It's called Hato Piñero. It's a ranch, a cattle ranch, private development in the Venezuelan tropical grasslands. As you know, there you have 6 months of total flooding, everything flooded, and 6 months of total drought, fires, absolutely dry. So it's a very difficult land to work on. So these people had cattle and they had a meat business. So they decided to do breeding cattle by choosing. They brought, I don't know how many exemplars until they found the best ones for that climate. And they also tried 400 types of grass to see which one would grow. So they chose the ones, and they ended up selling to all the other cattle ranchers around the grass, the seed. This is all innovation. They were doing actual innovation for the type of cattle and the type of grass. Then they had an environmental protection thing, which had a biological research center, because the whole place was declared by the owners a nature reserve. To that, then, they had surplus breeding of baby alligators for leather, which they were allowed to sell after, when they had more than, etc. They had a system for water and fire management, which they could sell to the others, which had to do with burning before it would burn on its own and organizing it so they got the best possible grass. And then they set up a wonderful ecotourism hotel, ecotourism services with bird watching, taking people around and so on. They brought scientists from all over the world to do research in the environmental protection thing in the research center, and they had to use the local population. And then the development of the local community was the last thing that they decided to do, because they had cattle robbing. People were robbing the cattle, entering with horses and taking some cattle away very frequently, and they had to call the police, and then they were trying themselves and so on. And they decided, no, we're going to create a belt of wealth around us. And they started helping the farmers around them to create a belt of well-being around the ranch, which is huge. Anyway, it was nationalized. The cattle business doesn't exist anymore. The grass seed business doesn't exist anymore. Nothing exists anymore except the ecotourism thing, which is in the hands of some people that are handling it perhaps okay, I don't know. But, I mean, this is one of the tragedies. And this is not just because of the Chavez government. Things like this, I have come to the conclusion that one of the definitions, the most serious definition of underdevelopment that I can come to is the incapacity for institutional accumulation. Everybody arrives and wants, instead of looking at what the other one was doing in order to do a little better, they come with a dream they had when they were named, and then they just go, zoom, destroy everything that was there, and start from scratch again. So we never get anywhere. It's this up escalator that goes down. Anyway, oh, sorry. I meant to say that a local system of innovation can provide occupation, education, incomes, and innovation in relation to the environmental context. This was done in this particular case by the private sector, but obviously it can be promoted by the public sector. It doesn't matter who promotes something like this, and especially if it has so much innovation involved. So the opportunities are many for the local, national, and export markets. I hate to give you a list because it's going to sound puny, but anyway, a little list. Medicinal herbs, gourmet fruits and vegetables, vacation farms, organic chocolate. By the way, there is a farm in Venezuela which has 5 little machines designed by an engineer, a machine designer. Those 5 little machines can take in a relatively small farm from cocoa all the way to chocolate and change radically the economy of that farm, because selling cocoa, of course, is very, at very low prices. But designing the 5 machines at that size is something that we can do, but it doesn't exist in the world because machines are very big for that. And yet they were doing special chocolate. Then mobile phone service, that's for locals while you get better phone service. Special marmalade or other local specialities that can be exported if they're good enough. Construction systems with local materials. There are many architects that could go, and then you could both have a business with the materials and the construction systems and the improvement of the living of the rest of the population, and so on. So bringing them, or others that you can think of that you'll do better than me, bringing them to fruition will require knowledge and organized support. But aiming at a major transformation across the whole territory would require an effort as massive as for the import substitution policies. I don't know if you know that for import substitution, there was the training of thousands and thousands of Latin American public servants in order to handle a very complex system that import substitution required, with all sorts of things and calculations and things like that. And it was done, I think, in Intal, next to CEPAL. Was it in Intal? So anyway, that, the training, the thinking, you have to sort of have a design, and it can be done. So my idea, should we train thousands of young graduates for 2 years of service in promoting wealth creation across the territory? Imagine those people would be trained for, say, 4 months maybe. They would work for 1.5 or 2 years helping create these things. They would be connected among themselves. They would come out as fantastic entrepreneurs because they have created 2 or 3 things in the country, perhaps. Should we set up a network of consultants from big companies willing to contribute over internet? I'm sure even the big European and American companies would be willing to give time to help do these things, to see if that's a good product, if there is market for it, what would you need to do, all the things that have to be added. Organizing a public-private funding effort to support the initiatives. Promoting export networks to handle the products, because of course the main problem is once you produce whatever it is that you're going to produce, then you have to get it abroad, you have to get it somewhere, and you probably need some form of network, and it could be promoted publicly or privately. And then training local governments to be development agents. We used to have this idea that governments would have national strategies. I think we can have national directions and do a lot of things with many policies. But I think now the actual strategies in the more concrete sense should be with local governments to help them actually transform the space over which they rule into a wealth-creating space so that people will remain and have a good life. It is no bigger nor more difficult than what CEPAL did in the past for import substitution, and it could make a huge difference. And let me tell you, we are precisely at a time when the whole world has to redefine which way it's going. And I think Latin America has opportunities which it will only take if it thinks big, if it thinks bold, and if it takes big decisions to transform the whole thing. Not solve little problems. Big thinking with a lot of policies that are systemic and that go in a complex direction. Thank you.